this episode, we turn to a part of artificial intelligence, AI, governance that many new learners underestimate until something goes wrong: documentation. At first glance, documentation can sound like the least interesting part of building an AI system, especially compared with model selection, testing, or deployment. But when an organization cannot explain why it chose a design, what assumptions shaped the build, what risks were known, what controls were added, or what changed over time, it becomes much harder to prove compliance or manage risk in a disciplined way. Documentation is what turns decisions into evidence. It makes the difference between a team saying it acted responsibly and a team being able to show, step by step, what it knew, what it chose, what it checked, and how it responded as the system moved from idea to design to build to use. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to think about documentation is that it tells the story of the system in a form other people can examine later. That story begins before anything is built, when the team defines the problem, the use case, the intended users, the affected stakeholders, and the role the system is supposed to play in a real workflow. It continues through requirements, design choices, data decisions, model selection, testing, approvals, controls, monitoring, changes, and incident response. Without that story, later reviewers are left with fragments. They may see a system in operation, but they will not know why certain choices were made or whether those choices were reasonable at the time. Good documentation is therefore not just memory support for the team that built the system. It is a durable record for leaders, auditors, legal reviewers, compliance staff, investigators, future builders, and others who may need to understand the system long after the original project team has changed or moved on. One of the most important reasons documentation matters is that AI systems often involve judgment calls rather than purely mechanical answers. A team may have to decide how broad the use case should be, which data is fit for purpose, which model approach matches the risk profile, what level of human oversight is necessary, which performance trade-offs are acceptable, and which risks are serious enough to narrow or delay deployment. Those are not trivial details. They are governance decisions, and governance decisions should not disappear into casual conversations, scattered messages, or the memory of a few individuals. When documentation captures those decisions clearly, the organization has something much more valuable than a pile of files. It has a record of reasoning. That record helps show that choices were made deliberately rather than casually, that risks were considered rather than ignored, and that the team understood the system as something requiring accountability instead of mere technical enthusiasm. For beginners, it helps to separate documentation into a few broad categories, even though the categories often overlap in practice. There is context documentation, which explains why the system exists and what problem it is meant to address. There is design documentation, which explains how the system is structured, what requirements it must meet, what data and model choices shape it, and what controls surround it. There is evaluation documentation, which records how the system was tested, benchmarked, piloted, and reviewed before broader use. There is operational documentation, which explains how the system is used, monitored, changed, and governed after deployment. Finally, there is incident and change documentation, which shows how the organization responded when something needed correction, escalation, or redesign. Thinking in these categories helps learners understand that documentation is not one long master document written at the end. It is a collection of connected records that together make the system legible and governable across its life cycle. Context documentation comes first because a system cannot be governed responsibly if nobody can state clearly what it is supposed to do. This early documentation should describe the business problem, the approved use case, the intended purpose, the users, the affected stakeholders, the environment in which the system will operate, and the boundaries of the use case. It should also explain what the system is not approved to do, because those limits are often just as important as the intended function. When teams skip this step, later records become weaker because everything else loses its anchor. Testing no longer maps cleanly to purpose. oversight becomes vague, and leaders may quietly expand the system into neighboring uses without realizing they have moved beyond the original governance assumptions. Strong context documentation prevents that drift by making the approved use case visible. It gives the organization a baseline against which later design choices, deployment changes, and monitoring findings can be judged. Design documentation then captures how the team translated purpose into a real system. This includes requirements, input and output expectations, architecture, data sources, model approach, human oversight design, thresholds, feedback paths, controls, and the assumptions that connect those pieces together. Design documentation should not just list what exists. It should explain why key choices were made and what alternatives were considered when the differences matter to risk or compliance. For example, if the team selected a narrower model approach because the use case demanded stronger predictability, that reasoning belongs in the record. If it limited the system to advisory use because the consequences of full automation were too serious, that belongs in the record as well. Documentation of this kind supports compliance because it shows that the organization did not simply assemble a system and hope for the best. It made visible design choices tied to purpose, risk, and operational reality. Data documentation deserves special attention because many governance failures begin with weak assumptions about the information shaping the system. A responsible organization should be able to describe what data was used, where it came from, how it was gathered, what role it plays in the system, what quality concerns were known, what exclusions or limitations were applied, and how the data relates to the intended use case. This does not mean every record must become a giant technical archive that no one can read. It means the organization needs enough clarity to show that it understood its data rather than treating it as a neutral raw material. If the data came from historical workflows, the documentation should capture whether those workflows contained inconsistencies or biases that matter for present use. If the system depends on live inputs or retrieved knowledge, the documentation should explain what those inputs are expected to look like and what happens when they are incomplete, outdated, or otherwise weak. Good data documentation reduces the risk of building confidence on foundations the team never truly examined. Evaluation documentation is another major pillar because compliance and risk management both depend on evidence that the system was challenged before and during deployment. This includes records of use case evaluation, benchmarking, pilots, testing methods, findings, and the decisions that followed from those findings. A team should not only record that testing happened. It should record what was tested, why those tests mattered, what limitations remained, where the system struggled, and what the organization did in response. If the pilot showed user over-reliance, that finding should appear in the record along with any changes to oversight or interface design. If benchmarking showed the system improved on a baseline only under narrow conditions, that should be documented so future teams understand why the use case was constrained. Evaluation records are powerful because they show whether the organization learned from evidence or merely collected it. A system that is well documented in this area is easier to trust because the record reveals not only performance claims, but also the seriousness with which the team examined weakness and uncertainty. Documentation also plays a major role in approvals and accountability. Someone has to decide whether the system is ready for a pilot, ready for deployment, ready for expanded scope, or in need of redesign or pause. Those decision points should be documented clearly enough that later reviewers can see who approved what, under what conditions, and with what known limitations. This is especially important in organizations where many teams touch the same system, because responsibility can become blurred very quickly when product teams, engineering teams, compliance functions, and operational leaders all assume someone else made the final risk judgment. Approval documentation helps prevent that confusion. It makes visible the decision rights within the organization and shows that important transitions in the system lifecycle were not treated as casual defaults. It also supports better internal discipline because people tend to make clearer decisions when they know those decisions will be recorded and may later be reviewed by others with less personal investment in the project. Operational documentation becomes critical once the system moves beyond design and testing into real use. At that point, the organization needs records showing how the system is actually used, what role humans play in oversight, what thresholds or review points exist, how feedback is captured, what logs are preserved, what metrics are tracked, and what conditions trigger escalation or reevaluation. This documentation is important because systems rarely behave in live operation exactly the way they behaved in controlled evaluation. Users may interpret outputs differently than expected, workflows may change, and edge cases may appear more often or in different forms than the design team predicted. Without operational documentation, the organization may have a record of good intentions but little evidence of disciplined use. With it, the organization can show how the system is governed in practice, not only how it was imagined before launch. That distinction matters greatly when leaders need to investigate problems, answer questions from oversight functions, or decide whether the system is still aligned with its approved purpose. Change documentation is one of the clearest signs of governance maturity because AI systems do not stay frozen for long. Models are updated, prompts are refined, thresholds are adjusted, interfaces are redesigned, data sources are replaced, and use cases are often expanded unless someone actively controls scope. Each meaningful change should leave a record that explains what changed, why it changed, what evidence supported the change, what risks were reconsidered, and whether any new approval or testing was required. This is not just a matter of process neatness. A system that changes without good records can quickly become something very different from the system that was originally reviewed or approved. When that happens, compliance claims weaken because the organization may still be pointing to older documentation that no longer describes reality. Good change documentation protects against that problem by keeping the system's records synchronized with the system itself. It supports risk management because it forces the team to ask whether a change alters the system's behavior, scope, or governance needs in a way that requires deeper review. Incident documentation matters for similar reasons, but it becomes especially important when the organization is under pressure. When an issue appears, whether it is a poor output, a missed escalation, a privacy concern, a fairness problem, or a broader operational failure, the team needs to document what happened, how it was discovered, what the impact was, what immediate actions were taken, what deeper investigation found, and what corrective steps followed. Good incident documentation should not read like an attempt to protect reputations at the expense of clarity. It should support learning and accountability by preserving the facts, the timeline, the decisions, and the changes made in response. This kind of record is essential for proving that the organization can do more than talk about responsible AI in calm moments. It shows whether the organization can investigate, adapt, and improve when real evidence of weakness appears. In that sense, incident documentation is not only about the past. It becomes part of the future safety and credibility of the system. One of the deeper benefits of documentation is that it improves internal decision quality even before anyone asks to see the records. Teams usually think more clearly when they know they must explain themselves in writing. Vague assumptions that feel acceptable in conversation often start to look weak when someone tries to document them precisely. Unclear ownership becomes easier to notice. Missing evidence becomes more obvious. Overly broad claims about performance or suitability become harder to defend once the team has to connect them to real tests, real use cases, and real controls. This is why documentation should not be viewed only as a burden imposed by compliance, audit, or regulation. It is also a governance discipline that improves the quality of the underlying work. A team that documents well is often a team that designs, tests, and governs more carefully because documentation exposes loose thinking before that loose thinking becomes a system others are expected to trust. At the same time, useful documentation is not the same as maximum documentation. A common mistake is to produce huge volumes of material that are so scattered, repetitive, or technical that the organization still cannot answer basic governance questions quickly when it matters most. The point is not to create paper for its own sake. The point is to create records that are accurate, current, understandable, connected, and strong enough to support oversight, compliance, learning, and risk response. This means documentation should be organized around meaningful decisions and lifecycle stages rather than around random file creation. It should also be maintained as a living record rather than treated as a one-time project task. If the system changes but the documentation does not, The organization eventually ends up with beautiful records describing a system that no longer exists. That is worse than having too little documentation, because it creates false confidence and weakens trust in the record itself. A simple example helps make this topic more concrete. Imagine a college builds an AI system to help staff sort incoming student support messages for urgency. Strong documentation would begin by recording the intended use case, the boundaries of the system, and the reason the college chose an advisory rather than fully automated design. It would capture the data sources used for development, the risks the team identified around misreading distress signals, the testing results from pilots, the thresholds for human review, and the approval conditions for moving into broader use. Later, if staff feedback revealed that certain types of student language were being handled poorly, the record would show what was changed, whether additional training or review steps were added, and how the college decided whether the system remained fit for purpose. That documentation would not merely prove that the college built something. It would prove that the college governed something, learned from operation, and kept the system tied to evidence instead of letting it drift through informal habit and assumption. By the end of this topic, the central lesson should feel very clear. Documentation is not a side task performed to satisfy bureaucracy after the real work is complete. It is part of the real work because it captures purpose, design reasoning, data choices, evaluation evidence, approvals, operational practice, changes, and incident response in a form that others can review, challenge, and learn from later. That is how documentation helps prove compliance. It shows what the organization did, what it knew, what it considered, and how it governed the system over time. It also helps manage risk because it keeps the system legible as people, models, workflows, and pressures change. A system that is poorly documented may still function for a while, but it becomes harder to supervise, harder to defend, and harder to improve the moment serious questions arise. A system that is well documented has a much better chance of remaining understandable, controllable, and trustworthy under real scrutiny. That is why documenting design and build decisions is not an administrative burden at the edge of governance. It is one of the clearest ways governance becomes visible and real.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.